The phone call came from a neighbor on a Tuesday afternoon in September 2023. George Patterson was 87 years old, sitting in his living room in Grundy County, Iowa, when his neighbor Helen said, "George, I think you need to see something on Facebook." "I don't have Facebook," George said. "Don't own a computer." "I know. That's why I'm calling. Your grandson posted something. It's about your tractor." 20 minutes later, Helen was at George's door with her iPad. She pulled up Facebook Marketplace, showed George the listing. "For sale, 1960 Farmall 560. Runs good. Needs some work. $12,000 OBO. Contact Brandon." There was a photo. George's 1960 Farmall 560, the tractor that had been in his family for 63 years, sitting in his own machine shed. His grandson Brandon had photographed it, listed it for sale, put George's phone number as the contact. George stared at the screen for a long time, then quietly, "Thank you for showing me this, Helen." After Helen left, George sat in his chair and thought. Brandon was his daughter Linda's son, 28 years old, worked in IT in Cedar Rapids. Brandon visited maybe 3 times a year, usually wanted something: money for a car payment, help with rent, once $5,000 for a business opportunity that never materialized. Brandon had been at the farm 2 weeks ago, asked about the tractor. "Grandpa, are you ever going to sell this old thing? It's just sitting in the shed. You don't even farm anymore. It's worth money." "Not for sale," George had said. "But why keep it? You're 87, you're not farming. It's just taking up space. I could sell it for you. We could split the money." "Not for sale," George repeated. Apparently Brandon had decided to sell it anyway. George picked up his phone, called his lawyer. "Bill, I need to change my will. Today, if possible." To understand why George's response was so immediate and so severe, you have to understand what that 1960 Farmall 560 represented. It wasn't just a tractor, it was the machine that had saved his family. George's father, Walter Patterson, had bought the 560 brand new in March 1960 for $5,200 cash. Walter was 58 years old then, had been farming since 1920, 40 years of working the same 280 acres in Grundy County. In 1960, Walter had a choice. He could buy new, or he could keep his aging 1948 Farmall M and save the money. Most farmers in 1960 were buying on credit. Dealers were pushing financing, easy payments. The post-war boom was in full swing. Walter paid cash, saved for 3 years to afford it. March 1960, walked into the International Harvester dealer in Grundy Center with $5,200 in a bank envelope. Bought the 560 outright. Drove it home. Never owed a penny on it. That decision, paying cash instead of financing, meant Walter entered the 1960s debt-free. Just his land payment, which he'd nearly paid off. By 1965, Walter owned everything free and clear. The land, the equipment, everything. When the agricultural recession hit in the late 1960s and early 1970s, when corn prices fell and farms started failing, Walter survived easily. No equipment debt, no pressure, just kept farming steady. George, who'd been farming alongside his father since 1955, learned the lesson: cash is king, debt is death. Walter died in 1978 at age 76. The 560 passed to George. By then the tractor was 18 years old, had about 9,000 hours on it, but Walter had maintained it meticulously. George kept farming with it. Through the 1980s farm crisis, while neighbors lost everything to equipment debt, George farmed with the paid-for 560. No payments, no pressure. Survived when everyone else failed. George's daughter Linda was born in 1968, grew up with that tractor, learned to drive on it when she was 12, helped George farm through high school, went to college in 1986, came back summers to help. The 560 was part of her childhood, part of her identity as a farm kid. Linda married a man from Cedar Rapids in 1992, moved to the city, had Brandon in 1995, raised him urban, Brandon visited the farm occasionally as a kid, but he was a city kid. Video games, internet, smartphones. The farm was just where Grandpa lived, the place you visited on holidays. George retired from active farming in 2010 at age 74, rented out his 280 acres to a neighbor, kept the 560 in his shed, maintained, started it monthly, used it occasionally for small projects around his property. The tractor was 50 years old by then, worth maybe $8,000, $10,000 to a collector, but to George, it was priceless. It represented his father's wisdom, his family's survival, the reason they still owned the farm when so many others had lost theirs. When Brandon posted that Facebook listing in September 2023, he didn't understand any of this. To Brandon, it was just an old tractor, worth money, taking up space. Grandpa wasn't using it. Why not sell it? But to George, Brandon's action represented something deeper, a fundamental disrespect for family history, for the values that had kept the family solvent, for the sacrifices his father had made. George called Brandon that evening. "Take down the listing. Grandpa, I'm just trying to help. You don't need that old tractor. $12,000. We could split it. $6,000 for you, $6,000 for me. That's good money." "I don't want to sell it. I never agreed to sell it. You listed my property for sale without permission. Take down the listing." "But Grandpa, be reasonable. You're 87. What are you going to do with that tractor? You can't even climb on it anymore. It's just sitting there losing value. Let me sell it while it's still worth something." "Brandon, that tractor is not about money. That tractor represents your great-grandfather paying cash in 1960 when everyone else was financing. That decision kept this family solvent through 2 agricultural recessions. That tractor is the reason you have a grandfather who owns land instead of a grandfather who lost everything in the 1980s. It's not for sale." "That's sentimental nonsense. It's a machine. Machines are meant to be used or sold. You're not using it. Sell it." "Take down the listing, Brandon." "No. I think you're being stubborn. I'm going to sell it and give you your half. You'll thank me later." George hung up, called his lawyer Bill Morrison. "I need to change my will. Brandon gets nothing. Everything goes to Linda and the local historical society." Bill said, "George, are you sure? This seems sudden." "I'm sure. Brandon just tried to sell my father's tractor without permission. Listed it on Facebook. When I told him to take it down, he refused. He doesn't understand what that tractor represents, doesn't understand family, doesn't respect my decisions. He gets nothing." The will was changed within a week. George's estate was worth approximately $1.2 million. The 280 acres worth about $950,000. Equipment and savings another $250,000. Under the old will, Linda got 60%, Brandon got 40%. Under the new will, Linda got 90%. The Grundy County Historical Society got 10%. Brandon got nothing. George didn't tell Brandon immediately. Wanted to see if Brandon would take down the listing voluntarily. He didn't. The listing stayed up for 3 weeks before George finally called Facebook and had it removed as unauthorized sale of property he didn't own. During those 3 weeks, George got 15 calls from people wanting to buy the tractor. He had to explain to each one that it wasn't actually for sale, that his grandson had posted it without permission. Embarrassing, infuriating. Brandon never apologized, never acknowledged he'd done anything wrong. When the listing got taken down, he texted George, "That was a mistake. Could have gotten $12K, your loss." George didn't respond. Linda found out about the listing from her mother, George's wife Mary, who'd passed in 2019. Linda called Brandon furious. "What were you thinking? That's Dad's tractor. You can't just sell someone's property." "It's an old tractor, Mom. He doesn't use it. I was trying to help." "Help? Brandon, that tractor means everything to Dad. It's not about money. It's about family history. Family history doesn't pay bills. $12,000 pays bills." Linda realized her son didn't get it. couldn't get it, had been raised too far from farming, too removed from the values that had sustained the family. She felt like she'd failed somehow. George lived 3 more years, died in October 2023 at age 90. The will reading happened 2 weeks later. Bill Morrison read the will to Linda and Brandon. When he got to the part where Brandon's inheritance was 0, Brandon's face went white. "That's a mistake. I'm his grandson. I should get at least 1/3. "It's not a mistake," Bill said. "George changed his will in September 2023. You received nothing." "Why? What did I do?" Linda knew. "The tractor. You tried to sell his tractor on Facebook. That was 3 years ago. Over an old tractor? He disinherited me over an old tractor?" "It wasn't an old tractor to him," Linda said quietly. "It was family. It was values. It was respect, and you didn't have any." Brandon tried to contest the will, claimed his grandfather had been senile, had been unduly influenced. The case went to court. The judge reviewed the evidence. George's medical record showing he was mentally sound until the end, the Facebook listing screenshots, the phone record showing George's immediate call to his lawyer. The judge dismissed the contest. Mr. Patterson made a conscious, competent decision to disinherit his grandson after the grandson attempted to sell his property without permission. The will stands. Brandon walked away with nothing from a $1.2 million estate. Linda inherited $1.08 million. The Grundy County Historical Society got $120,000, and the 1960 Farmall 560, Linda kept it, donated it to the Historical Society Museum on permanent loan with a plaque, Patterson Family 1960 Farmall 560. Purchased cash by Walter Patterson, March 1960. This tractor represents the wisdom of avoiding debt and the importance of family values. On loan from the Patterson family. The tractor sits in the museum today, 64 years old, still runs. The museum fires it up once a month, demonstrates it at county fairs, uses it to teach about agricultural history. Brandon sees it sometimes when he drives past the museum, the tractor that cost him $480,000 in inheritance. The $12,000 he thought he could get for it versus the fortune he lost by trying. The grandson tried to sell Grandpa's 1960 Farmall on Facebook. Grandpa wrote him out of the will. Sometimes the cost of disrespecting family history is higher than you can imagine. But the full story of how a Facebook listing destroyed a family inheritance requires understanding the 28 years of relationship between George Patterson and his grandson Brandon, and why that single action represented the final straw. Brandon was born in November 1995 in Cedar Rapids. Linda and her husband Tom lived in a suburban neighborhood, worked professional jobs, Linda as a nurse, Tom as an accountant. They visited George's farm maybe 6 times a year when Brandon was young. Christmas, Easter, 4th of July, Thanksgiving, a few random visits. Young Brandon liked the farm in that way city kids do, as a novelty, a place to run around, different from home. George tried to teach him farming, tried to pass on the values. But Brandon was always more interested in going back inside to play Nintendo. When Brandon was 8, in 2003, George took him out to the shed to show him the 1960 Farmall 560. The tractor was 43 years old then, still running perfectly. "This tractor was your great-grandfather's," George said. "He bought it new in 1960, paid cash, $5,200. That was a lot of money back then." Brandon looked at it, bored. "It's old." "It is old, but it still works. Your great-grandfather took care of it. I've taken care of it. Someday maybe you'll take care of it." "Why? Why not just buy a new one?" "Because this one works. And because it reminds us that your great-grandfather was wise enough to pay cash instead of taking debt. That wisdom kept our family afloat when other families lost everything." Brandon didn't understand. He was 8. The concept of family history, of meaningful possessions, of values embedded in objects. These were abstractions. He just saw an old tractor. George tried other approaches over the years. When Brandon was 12, George taught him to drive the 560. Started it up, let Brandon sit on his lap and steer, while George worked the pedals. Brandon thought it was fun, for about 10 minutes, then wanted to go back inside to the computer. When Brandon was 16, in 2011, George was 75 and had just retired from farming. He invited Brandon to spend a week at the farm that summer, thought maybe immersion would work where visits hadn't. Brandon came reluctantly, spent the week on his phone. George tried to engage him, tried to teach him about the farm's history, about the values that had sustained them. Brandon was polite, but disinterested. One evening that week, George sat Brandon down and told him the full story. In 1960, your great-grandfather had a choice. He could buy this tractor on credit. Most farmers were doing that, dealers were pushing it, or he could save up and pay cash. He chose cash, saved for 3 years. That decision meant he had no equipment debt going into the 1960s and 70s. George pulled out old ledgers, showed Brandon his grandfather's meticulous records. See, no debt, just steady profit. When corn prices fell in the early 70s, farms with debt failed. Your great-grandfather survived because he had no payments to make. Brandon looked at the ledgers, nodded politely, clearly wanted to be anywhere else. The lesson, George said, is that debt is dangerous. Owning things outright gives you freedom. This tractor represents that freedom. It's not just a machine, it's a symbol of making smart choices. That's cool, Grandpa, Brandon said, then went back to his phone. George realized he was losing the battle. This generation, Brandon's generation, didn't value the same things. They valued experiences, novelty, instant gratification. Old tractors and family history? Boring. Over the next 12 years, from 2011 to 2023, Brandon visited the farm maybe twice a year. Usually needed something. Money, mostly. In 2014, Brandon was 19, needed $800 for college textbooks. George gave it to him, never saw it repaid. In 2016, Brandon needed $2,500 for a security deposit on an apartment. George loaned it. Brandon promised to pay it back. Didn't. In 2018, Brandon asked for $5,000 for a cryptocurrency investment opportunity. George said no. Brandon got angry, didn't visit for 8 months. In 2020, during COVID, Brandon asked for $3,000 to help with rent since he'd been laid off. George gave it. Brandon got a new job 3 weeks later, never mentioned repaying the money. By 2023, George had loaned or given Brandon approximately $11,300 over 9 years. Brandon had repaid exactly $0. George never asked for it back. Family is family. But he noticed that Brandon only called when he needed money. Noticed that Brandon never asked about George, about his health, about his life, just asked for money and left. Linda noticed too. Dad, you don't have to keep giving him money. He's my grandson. He's using you. Maybe, but he's family. What else can I do? What George didn't know was that Brandon saw him as an ATM, not a grandfather, saw the farm as a bank account waiting to be accessed, saw the eventual inheritance as money he was owed for being born into the family. That perspective, that inheritance was an entitlement rather than a gift, was what led Brandon to list the tractor on Facebook in September 2023. Brandon had visited in early September ostensibly to check on Grandpa, really to assess assets. He was 28, working an IT job making $52,000 a year, living paycheck to paycheck, drowning in credit card debt from lifestyle inflation. He needed money. He walked through George's shed, saw the 1960 Farmall 560 sitting there, cleaned and maintained, obviously valuable. Did some research on his phone, found comparable tractors listed for $10,000 to $15,000. Thought, that's money just sitting there. Grandpa, "What are you doing with this old tractor?" "Keeping it, starting it monthly, maintaining it." "But why? You don't farm anymore. You could sell it." "Not interested in selling. But it's worth like 12, 15,000. That's real money." "It's not about money, Brandon. That tractor is family history." Brandon didn't understand, didn't want to understand. Just saw $12,000 sitting in a shed, unused, wasteful in his mind. 2 weeks later, Brandon posted the listing. Figured he'd sell it, give Grandpa half, pocket half. Grandpa would be upset initially, but would get over it once he saw the money. Win-win in Brandon's calculation. He was wrong. When George saw that listing, something broke. Not just the unauthorized sale, though that was bad enough. The deeper issue, Brandon's complete disregard for George's clearly stated wishes. George had said the tractor wasn't for sale. Brandon listed it anyway. That disrespect, that arrogance, that assumption that Brandon knew better than George what George should do with George's property, that's what crossed the line. George had tolerated the money requests, had tolerated the broken promises, had tolerated being treated as an ATM. But he would not tolerate his property being sold against his will by a grandson who valued money more than family. The call to Bill Morrison, the lawyer, was immediate. "Bill, I need you to draft a new will. Today, if possible. Brandon gets nothing. 0. Linda gets 90%. Local Historical Society gets 10%. Brandon is completely disinherited." Bill had known George for 40 years. "George, this is a major decision. Are you sure? Maybe take a few days to think about it." "I'm sure. Brandon just tried to sell my father's tractor without permission. When I told him to take down the listing, he refused. Told me I was being stubborn. Told me to let him sell it. He doesn't respect me. Doesn't respect family. Doesn't deserve inheritance." "Disinheritance is hard to undo. If you change your mind later, I won't change my mind. Do it." Bill drafted the new will. George signed it 3 days later. The old will, which would have given Brandon approximately $480,000, was revoked. The new will gave him nothing. George didn't tell Brandon immediately. Part of him hoped Brandon would realize his mistake, apologize, take down the listing voluntarily. That hope lasted 2 weeks. During those 2 weeks, George received 14 calls from potential buyers. Each conversation was humiliating. "Hi, I'm calling about the Farmall 560 you have listed on Facebook. That's not my listing. My grandson posted it without permission. The tractor's not for sale." "Oh, well, if you change your mind, I'm interested." After the 8th call, George stopped answering his phone. Let them go to voicemail. The humiliation of having to explain repeatedly that his own grandson had listed his property for sale without permission was too much. He tried calling Brandon again. "Take down the listing." "Grandpa, I already have 3 people interested at 11,000. Let me close one of these deals. You'll get 5,500, I'll get 5,500. That's good money for both of us." "I don't want the money. I want you to respect my decision. Take down the listing." "Your decision is irrational. You're being stubborn for no reason. I'm doing this for your own good." George hung up. That phrase, "for your own good," was the final insult. A 28-year-old who'd never farmed a day, who understood nothing about family history or values, telling an 87-year-old farmer what was for his own good. George called Facebook's helpline, reported the listing as unauthorized sale of property. It took 3 weeks and multiple calls, but eventually Facebook removed it. Brandon texted, "Really? You had Facebook take it down? That was money, Grandpa. Money you and I both could have used. This is stupid." George didn't respond. Just went out to his shed, started the 560, let it run for 20 minutes, while he sat on the seat and thought about his father, about the values that had sustained them, about how completely he'd apparently failed to pass those values to his grandson. Linda learned about the listing from a friend who'd seen it on Facebook and called to ask if George was really selling. Linda called Brandon immediately, furious. "What is wrong with you? That's Dad's tractor. You can't just sell people's things." "Mom, it's a tractor, an old tractor that's just sitting there. Dad's not using it. I was trying to help him monetize an asset." "Monetize an asset? Brandon, that's your grandfather's prized possession. It's not about money." "Everything is about money, Mom. That tractor is worth $12,000 sitting in a shed serving no purpose. That's wasteful. I was going to sell it and split the money with him." "He doesn't want to sell it. How many times does he have to say no before you listen? He's 87 and stubborn. Sometimes you have to make decisions for old people when they're not thinking clearly." Linda felt sick. "Brandon, Dad is thinking perfectly clearly. You're the one not thinking. That tractor represents everything our family survived. Great-grandpa bought it cash in 1960. That decision kept us solvent through 2 recessions. That tractor is why you have a grandfather who owns land instead of a grandfather who lost everything. It's family history. And you tried to sell it on Facebook like it was a used couch. That's sentimental nonsense. That's family, Brandon. That's values. That's respect. 3 things you apparently don't understand." Linda hung up, shaking, called her father. "Dad, I'm so sorry. I don't know what's wrong with him." "Not your fault, Linda. You raised him right. Sometimes kids grow up to be different than you hope. What are you going to do?" George was quiet for a moment. Then, "I already did it. Changed my will last week. Brandon gets nothing." "Dad, that's severe." "Is it? He tried to sell my property without permission. Refused to take down the listing when I asked. Told me I was being irrational. Called my decision stupid. Linda, he doesn't respect me. Doesn't respect this family. Why should he benefit from a family he doesn't respect?" Linda wanted to argue but couldn't. Her son had crossed a line, a clear, bright line, and there were consequences. George lived 3 more years, from September 2023 to October 2023. During those 3 years, Brandon visited exactly twice. Both times he asked for money. George said no both times. "I'm not giving you any more money, Brandon." "Why not? I'm your grandson. You're also the grandson who tried to sell my property without permission. I don't trust you. That was ages ago. Are you still mad about that tractor?" "I'm not mad. I'm disappointed. And I've made my decision." Brandon left both visits angry, feeling like his grandfather was being unreasonably stubborn over an old tractor. What Brandon didn't know was that George had told Linda about the will change. Linda knew Brandon was getting nothing. She tried to warn him, subtly. "Brandon, you should try to repair your relationship with your grandfather." "Why? He's the one holding a grudge over a tractor." "It's not about the tractor. It's about respect, about family. You hurt him deeply. By trying to help him sell something he wasn't using? That's ridiculous." "It's not ridiculous to him, and there might be consequences you're not considering." "What, he's going to disinherit me over a tractor?" Linda didn't answer. Let Brandon interpret her silence however he wanted. He interpreted it as his mother being dramatic, couldn't imagine his grandfather would actually disinherit him. They were family. Family didn't do that. George Patterson died on October 12th, 2023. Heart attack in his sleep. He was 90 years old, had lived a good life, owned his land free and clear until the end. The funeral was large. George had been well known in Grundy County, respected farmer, pillar of the community. Over 200 people attended. Brandon showed up in a suit, played the grieving grandson role, hugged his mother, shook hands, accepted condolences, thought about the inheritance. had calculated it would be maybe $400,000, $500,000 after his mother got her share. Enough to pay off his debts, buy a house, maybe take that trip to Europe he'd always wanted. The will reading was scheduled for 2 weeks after the funeral. Linda and Brandon sat in Bill Morrison's office. Bill read through the standard legal language, then got to the distributions. To my daughter, Linda Patterson Chen, I leave 90% of my estate, including all real property, equipment, and personal effects. Linda nodded, expected. To the Grundy County Historical Society, I leave 10% of my estate for the purpose of agricultural education and preservation. Brandon's stomach dropped. 90 plus 10 was 100. There was nothing left. Wait, Brandon said. What about me? Bill looked at him over his glasses. You're not mentioned in the will. That's a mistake. I'm his grandson. Where's my share? You receive no share. The will is explicit. Linda receives 90%. The Historical Society receives 10%. That's the entirety of the estate distribution. Brandon's face went white. That can't be right. Check again. Bill pulled out the will, showed Brandon the signature, the date, September 18th, 2023. He changed his will 3 years ago, Bill said. You were disinherited at that time. Why? What did I do? Linda spoke quietly. The tractor, Brandon. You tried to sell his tractor on Facebook. That was 3 years ago. He disinherited me over an old tractor. It wasn't about the tractor, Bill said. According to my notes from when George changed the will, it was about respect. About you attempting to sell his property without permission, then refusing to stop when he asked you to. He felt you didn't respect him or the family values he'd tried to teach you. Brandon stood up angry. This is insane. He was senile. He wasn't thinking clearly. I want to contest this. Bill remained calm. You're welcome to try, but I should tell you that George was evaluated by his physician 2 months ago as part of estate planning. Dr. Sanders found him mentally competent, no signs of dementia or diminished capacity. The will is valid. Brandon hired a lawyer, filed a contest, claimed undue influence, claimed George had been mentally incompetent, claimed the will was unfair. The case went before Judge Patricia Reynolds in Grundy County District Court in February 2024. Brandon's lawyer presented his case. Disinheritance over a single Facebook listing 3 years earlier was excessive and suggested diminished mental capacity. Bill Morrison, representing the estate, presented George's medical records, showing sharp mental faculties until the end. Presented the Facebook listing screenshots, showing Brandon's unauthorized sale attempt. Presented phone records, showing George immediately called his lawyer after discovering the listing. Most damaging, Bill presented a letter George had written and placed with his will in 2023 to be read only if the will was contested. To whom it may concern, George had written. If my grandson Brandon is contesting my will, I want to make clear that my decision to disinherit him was made with full mental capacity and after careful consideration. Brandon's attempt to sell my father's 1960 Farmall 560 without my permission was not an isolated incident. It was the culmination of years of Brandon treating me as an ATM rather than a grandfather. I have loaned or given him approximately $1,100 over 9 years, which he never repaid. He visits only when he needs money. When I explicitly told him the tractor was not for sale, he listed it anyway and refused to take down the listing. This showed fundamental disrespect for my decisions, my property, and my family's values. I disinherited him because he has shown through his actions that he does not value family, does not respect elders, and sees inheritance as an entitlement rather than a gift. My decision is final and deliberate. Judge Reynolds read the letter aloud in court. Brandon's face turned red. Mr. Patterson, the judge said, did you attempt to sell your grandfather's tractor without permission in September 2023? Yes. But I was trying to help. Did your grandfather ask you to take down the listing? Yes, but did you take it down when he asked? No, but he was being irrational. Thank you, I've heard enough. Judge Reynolds looked at Brandon with something close to disgust. Mr. Patterson attempted to sell his grandfather's property without authorization. When asked to stop, he refused and told his grandfather the decision to not sell was irrational. This demonstrates exactly the disrespect your grandfather described in his letter. The will is valid. Contest dismissed. Brandon appealed. The appellate court upheld the decision. By the time legal fees were paid, Brandon had spent $23,000 fighting for an inheritance he'd lost because he tried to sell a $12,000 tractor. The estate settled in June 2024. Total value, $1,187,000. Linda received $1,068,300. The Grundy County Historical Society received $118,700. Brandon received nothing and was out $23,000 in legal fees. The 1960 Farmall 560, the tractor that cost Brandon his inheritance, Linda donated it to the Historical Society Museum. It sits there today, fully restored, with a placard explaining its history. Brandon drives past the museum occasionally, sees his great-grandfather's tractor on display. The tractor he thought was just sitting there serving no purpose. The tractor he tried to sell for $12,000. The decision that cost him $491,300 when you factor in lost inheritance and legal fees. Sometimes he thinks about stopping, about looking at it, about understanding what his grandfather tried to teach him about family and values and respect. He never does, just drives past, still doesn't get it. The grandson tried to sell Grandpa's 1960 Farmall on Facebook. Grandpa wrote him out of the will. Sometimes the cost of valuing money over family is higher than any price tag.